30 miles south of San Francisco, hidden among the Santa Cruz Mountains, sits one of California's most beautiful secrets: 16 acres of formal gardens, a 54,000 square foot Georgian mansion, 654 acres of pristine watershed land. Today, hundreds of thousands visit Filoli each year, wandering through garden rooms that seem lifted from an English country estate, marveling at interiors that Hollywood chose to represent ultimate wealth and power. But this wasn't always a place strangers could enter. For nearly 60 years, Filoli belonged to just two families. The man who built it controlled the water flowing into every San Francisco home. He owned one of California's richest gold mines. By the time he decided to create this estate, William Bowers, born II, had already amassed a fortune that would be worth billions today. He had everything money could buy, everything except time. The story of Filoli isn't just about gardens and ballrooms. It's about a man who tried to build paradise while his body failed him. About a daughter who died an ocean away. About a wife who watched her family disappear. About the heiress who saved what they created. 4 members of the Bourne family are buried on this property. You won't see their graves on the public tour. Before Filoli became a symbol of California's golden age, before it represented the last intact peninsula estate from that era, it was something else entirely. It was supposed to be a place to grow young. Instead, it became the place where an empire ended. This is the story of how California's most beautiful estate was built, who paid the price, and why it survived when so many others didn't. Chapter 1. The Empire's Heir. William Bowers, born II, never expected to inherit anything. He was 17 years old in January 1875 when his mother summoned him home from Cambridge University. The telegram arrived without warning. His father's estate was collapsing. The family fortune was evaporating. Come home immediately. The young man who boarded the ship in England had been raised in luxury on San Francisco's Nob Hill. His father, William Bourne Sr., had arrived in California during the gold rush with nothing and built an empire. Mining investments, banking, insurance. The family lived like royalty. But something had gone wrong. William Sr. had acquired controlling interest in the Empire mine near Grass Valley in 1869. For a few years the operation thrived. Then production dropped. The ore seemed to be running out. Water flooded the deeper shafts. By 1874, the mine was barely profitable. That July, William Bourne Sr. cleaned a revolver in his Nob Hill study. The gun discharged. Whether it was accident or something darker, the coroner couldn't say. He died from the wound. His son was studying classics at Cambridge when it happened. The estate that young William inherited was a mess. His father's investments had been leveraged against each other. The Empire mine was failing. Debts were mounting. At 22 years old, William Bourne II faced a choice: let everything collapse, or fight. He chose to fight. The mine everyone said was finished still had something. William was certain of it. The problem wasn't the gold, it was how they were getting to it. Most mining engineers believed you couldn't profitably work below 1,200 feet. The water seepage was too severe, the costs too high. William pushed deeper anyway. He brought in his cousin George Starr, a 19-year-old who understood mining technology. Together they reorganized everything: new pumping systems, better drilling equipment. They hired Cornish miners from England, men whose families had worked tin and copper mines for generations. These workers knew how to handle water. They knew how to work hard rock. For several years, the Empire mine barely broke even. Operating expenses consumed almost everything, but William kept pushing the shafts down, 1,500 feet, 1,800, 2,000. By 1884, the mine was profitable again. Over the next 4 decades, the Empire mine would produce nearly 6 million ounces of gold. It became one of the richest mines in California history. The young man who'd been called home from Cambridge had saved his family's fortune and built something even larger. But gold wasn't enough. In the 1890s, William turned his attention to something every growing city desperately needed: water. San Francisco's population was exploding. The few natural springs and wells couldn't keep up. Private water companies fought brutal wars for control. By 1890, one company had emerged as the monopoly: Spring Valley Water Company. William began buying shares. The Spring Valley Water Company owned vast watersheds in San Mateo County. They controlled Crystal Springs Reservoir. They had the power of eminent domain, meaning they could seize land and water rights for the public good while operating as a private, profit-making enterprise. It was one of the most powerful monopolies in California. By 1908, William Bowers Bourne II was president of Spring Valley Water Company. He controlled the water supply for hundreds of thousands of people. He set the rates they paid. He decided where pipes would be laid and which neighborhoods would get service first. The arrangement made him spectacularly wealthy. It also made him spectacularly unpopular. San Francisco residents paid 24 cents per 1,000 gallons. Los Angeles, with city-owned water, paid 10 cents for the same amount. Newspapers ran cartoons depicting Spring Valley as an octopus strangling the city. Editorial writers called for public ownership. William didn't particularly care what newspapers said. He believed private enterprise did things better than government. He ran Spring Valley Water Company efficiently. The infrastructure worked. The water flowed. But he knew the monopoly couldn't last forever. San Francisco was already planning an alternative, a massive project to dam the Hetch Hetchy Valley and pipe water over 160 miles from the Sierra Nevada mountains. That project would take decades. In the meantime, William controlled something everyone needed. By 1914, William Bowers Bourne II was 57 years old. He owned an estate in San Francisco on Webster Street. He owned the Empire Mine Cottage in Grass Valley. He owned Muckross House in Ireland. He had investments in gas companies, banks, real estate. He had everything a Gilded Age industrialist could want. Except a country place near San Francisco where he and his wife could escape. A place to entertain. A place to garden. A place to, in his words, grow young. He began looking at land on the San Francisco Peninsula. The prices were reasonable. The earthquake of 1906 had driven many wealthy families to build estates outside the city. The Crockers were there. The Coles. The Carolans. William wanted something different. He didn't want to be visible from the road. He wanted privacy. He wanted land with water. In 1914, he found it. 654 acres in Woodside at the southern end of Crystal Springs Reservoir. His own reservoir. His own water company's land. The perfect location. He called his architect, a man he'd worked with before. A man who understood both grand statements and California practicality. Willis Polk answered the call. Chapter 2, The Perfect Valley. The land William Bourne purchased sat on the eastern slope of the Santa Cruz Mountains, looking down toward a valley that held two massive reservoirs. Crystal Springs Reservoir was no accident of nature. Spring Valley Water Company had built it by damming creeks that once flowed freely to San Francisco Bay. The upper reservoir had been completed in the 1870s. The lower one followed 2 decades later. William knew this land intimately. As president of Spring Valley, he'd spent years overseeing the water system. He'd walked these hillsides. He'd studied the watershed. He knew where springs emerged from the ground and how water moved through the landscape. When he decided to build a country estate, he didn't look at Burlingame or Hillsborough, where other wealthy families were clustering. He looked at his own company's holdings. The site he chose had everything. Mature oak trees hundreds of years old, natural springs feeding into creeks, southern exposure for gardens, views down to the reservoirs and across to the coastal range, 654 acres of privacy. It was also close enough to San Francisco that he could reach it easily, 30 miles by automobile, an hour's drive on improving roads, far enough to feel like escape, near enough to manage his business interests. The timing mattered. The earthquake and fires of 1906 had devastated San Francisco. William's Webster Street mansion survived, but the city felt dangerous now. Unpredictable. The financial district had burned. Thousands were homeless. Reconstruction would take years. Wealthy families who'd lived exclusively in San Francisco began building country retreats. Peninsula estates offered something the city couldn't: stability, space, and safety from future disasters. William was 57 when he started buying the Woodside parcels. His wife Agnes was 53. Their only surviving child, daughter Maud, was already married and living in Ireland at Muckross House, the spectacular estate William had purchased for her as a wedding gift. This wouldn't be a house for raising children. It would be a place for the next phase of life, entertaining friends, hosting musical performances, gardening, living well. William had a philosophy he'd developed over the years. 3 principles that guided him: fight for a just cause, love your fellow man, live a good life. He wanted a name for his estate that captured those ideals. Taking the first 2 letters from the key words of his credo, he created an acronym: F-I from fight, L-O from love, L-I from live, Filoli. The name meant something only to those who understood its origin. To everyone else, it was simply Italian-sounding and elegant, which was fine. William wasn't building this place to explain himself to strangers. The site had one particular feature that fascinated him. Several creeks cut through the property, including one that marked the San Andreas Fault. The earthquake fault that had devastated San Francisco ran directly through his land. Most people would have seen that as a liability. William saw it as part of California's geology, part of the landscape. The fault had been there for millions of years, and would be there for millions more. You built carefully, and you accepted that this was earthquake country. The bigger concern was making the estate self-sufficient. William wanted extensive gardens, which meant irrigation. He wanted fruit orchards. He wanted to produce as much as possible on site rather than depending on outside suppliers. Fortunately, water was the one thing he'd never lack. Springs on the property provided clean water year-round. If that wasn't enough, he quite literally owned the reservoir below. By late 1914, William had acquired all the land he wanted. Now he needed an architect who could design something appropriate. The house had to reflect his position. Georgian style, the architecture of wealth and establishment. But it also had to work in California. That meant accommodating the climate, using local materials where practical, creating something that looked like it belonged rather than like it had been transplanted from Virginia. William had worked with Willis Polk before. Polk had designed the Webster Street mansion in San Francisco back in 1896. He'd designed the Empire Cottage at the gold mine. He understood William's taste. More importantly, Polk understood how to create buildings that made a statement without shouting. The call went out. Come to Woodside. Look at the site. Design something worthy of the location. Willis Polk arrived, walked the land, and began to imagine. Chapter 3, Willis Polk's Vision. Willis Jefferson Polk was 57 years old when William Bourne asked him to design Filoli. He'd been practicing architecture for 35 years. He'd survived professional bankruptcy, personal tragedy, and the complete destruction of downtown San Francisco in the earthquake and fires. By 1914, Polk was one of California's most respected architects. He designed banks, mansions, office buildings. His Halidi building on Sutter Street featured a revolutionary glass curtain wall. His work on the Palace of Fine Arts for the Panama Pacific Exposition had helped define San Francisco's post-earthquake renaissance. Polk and Bourne had a relationship built on trust. William didn't micromanage. He told Polk what he wanted in general terms, then let the architect work. The Webster Street mansion had succeeded because Polk understood that William wanted dignity, not ostentation. Filoli would require something different. The site demanded a horizontal composition. Building up would look ridiculous on this sprawling property. The house needed to spread across the landscape, anchoring itself to the hillside while taking advantage of views. Polk chose Georgian Revival as the primary style. Symmetry, balance, brick construction, the architecture of colonial Virginia and England. Traditional, establishment, conservative. Exactly the image William wanted to project, but California wasn't Virginia. Polk made critical adaptations. Instead of slate, he specified red clay tile for the roof. The color and material belonged to California's Spanish missions. The tiles could handle the climate and looked appropriate on the landscape. He designed in Flemish bond brickwork, alternating headers and stretchers, creating a subtle pattern, more interesting than common bond, more expensive, the kind of detail that separated serious architecture from mere building. The plan centered on a grand transverse hall running perpendicular to the entrance. This created an enfilade, a series of rooms opening one into another along an axis. From the reception room, you could look through the drawing room into the dining room and glimpse the library beyond. European palaces used this technique to create drama and demonstrate wealth. Polk deployed it at Filoli to make the house feel larger than it was, and to frame views through the building. He placed the major entertaining spaces, ballroom, reception room, drawing room, dining room, on the main floor, family spaces upstairs, service areas in the south wing. Everything arranged logically, but designed to impress visitors from the moment they entered. The scale was substantial, 54,000 square feet, 56 rooms, but Polk avoided the grotesque exaggeration of some Gilded Age mansions. No 90-foot-tall entrance halls, no ballrooms that could hold 500 people. Filoli was large, but still felt like a house where people actually lived. Construction began in 1915. The site required extensive preparation, grading to create terraces, foundation work that could handle earthquake loads, bringing in materials and skilled craftsmen. Polk supervised but didn't appear on site daily. He was juggling multiple projects. His office handled the details. The general contractor managed the workers. They used waste rock from the Empire Mine, stone that had come out of the earth when searching for gold, as decorative elements and foundation material. William liked the symbolism. The gold that built his fortune literally became part of the estate. Brick by brick, the house took shape. The Georgian facade emerged. French windows were installed to capture light and frame garden views. Chimneys rose in pairs, arched and elegant. Inside, craftsmen installed parquet floors in different patterns for each major room. Oak in the ballroom, American black walnut paneling in the library, carved moldings throughout, plaster ceilings with subtle details. The ballroom would be the largest room, 32 feet wide, 70 feet long, with a ceiling 22.5 feet high. Not enormous by palace standards, but spacious enough for 100 guests to dance comfortably. Agnes Bourne involved herself in certain details. The music room needed excellent acoustics. She was an accomplished pianist and wanted to host chamber concerts. The kitchen had to be functional for staff preparing meals for large gatherings. William focused on the larger issues, making sure the house connected properly to the gardens he was already planning, ensuring water systems would work, getting the proportions right. By 1917, after 2 years of construction, Filoli was complete. The reported cost exceeded $400,000, equivalent to over $10 million today, but still modest compared to some contemporary estates. Hearst was spending millions building his castle at San Simeon. The Crocker Mansion in Burlingame cost even more. William had built something impressive without being vulgar. Georgian elegance adapted to California, a house that looked like it had always belonged on this hillside. In September 1917, William and Agnes moved in. He was 60 years old. She was 56. Their daughter was living in Ireland. They had perhaps 20 good years left to enjoy what they'd created. William stood on the terrace looking down toward the reservoirs in the valley beyond. His valley, his water, his land. He'd saved the Empire Mine, built Spring Valley Water Company into a force, survived the earthquake, created this estate. He had everything he'd worked for. He had 5 years before the stroke came. Chapter 4. A House for Entertaining. Filoli wasn't built for privacy. It was built to be seen. The moment you entered through the front door, you understood who William Bourne was and what he'd accomplished. The reception room hit you immediately. 2 stories high, paneled in walnut, with a grand staircase rising to the second floor. This was the space where first impressions happened, where Agnes would greet guests arriving for dinner parties or musical evenings, where San Francisco society would gather before moving into other rooms. The enfilade that Polk had designed let you see through multiple rooms at once. Standing in the reception room, you could look straight through the drawing room and glimpse the dining room beyond. The sightlines were deliberate. You were meant to want to explore further. The drawing room served as a transitional space between entrance and dining. Linen-covered walls gave it a softer feel than the walnut-paneled reception room. A Carrara marble fireplace, deliberately underscaled, created an intimate seating area. But the room's real purpose was circulation, getting guests from one place to another while maintaining the illusion of spontaneous elegance. Then came the dining room. Dark-stained oak paneling from floor to ceiling, hand-carved moldings, a table that could seat 24. This was where William demonstrated he'd arrived at the pinnacle of California society. Dinner parties at Filoli followed strict protocol. Guests dressed formally. Multiple courses appeared in careful sequence, prepared by staff in the kitchen and carried through the butler's pantry. Agnes would seat people according to status and strategy, who needed to talk to whom, which business relationships needed cultivating. The room's formality reinforced the message. This was serious entertaining, not casual hospitality. But the ballroom exceeded everything else. 70 feet long, 32 feet wide, with a ceiling that soared 22.5 feet. The scale was breathtaking. Parquet floors in quarter-sawn white oak. Walls painted a pale water-green color, trimmed with gold leaf on the moldings. 2 massive chandeliers hung from the ceiling, modeled on the ones in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Crystal and gilded bronze. They weren't reproductions. They were interpretations, scaled appropriately for the room. The fireplace dominated the far end. Baroque styling in Machiavelli marble, with ormolu decorations showing Hercules and the Nemean lion. The kind of fireplace that belonged in a European palace. This room was Agnes's domain. She was a patron of the San Francisco Symphony and Opera. She hosted chamber music performances here. Her piano stood ready. Guest musicians would perform. Audiences of 50 to 100 would sit in careful arrangement, listening to music echoing off the high ceiling. The ballroom could also accommodate dancing, wedding receptions, debut balls for society daughters. It was the single most impressive space in the house, designed specifically to demonstrate that Filoli could host events that matched anything in San Francisco proper. But here's what visitors didn't see: the machinery that made it all work. The butler's pantry connected the dining room to the kitchen. Here, staff had access to everything they needed. A walk-in safe for storing silver, an electric call board showing which rooms needed service, a dumbwaiter for moving food and dishes between floors. The kitchen itself was utilitarian but massive. A 17-foot-high COVID ceiling helped dissipate heat from cooking. Industrial stoves, work tables, storage. During large events, staff prepared as many as 9 meals a day. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner for family upstairs, plus separate meals for servants, plus whatever the event required. Up to 35 staff lived and worked at Filoli at various times. Cooks, housekeepers, maids, groundskeepers, chauffeurs. They worked 14-hour days with 1 day off every 2 weeks. This was standard for wealthy estates of the period. The servants' quarters occupied the south wing. Small rooms, shared bathrooms, basic furnishings. These spaces weren't meant to be seen by guests. They were purely functional. The separation between public and private spaces was absolute. When the Bournes entertained, guests experienced elegance and luxury. They didn't see the work required to produce it. William and Agnes hosted frequently in the years immediately after completion. Musical evenings, dinner parties for business associates, weekend gatherings for friends from San Francisco. The house performed exactly as designed. It impressed everyone. It confirmed William's position at the top of California society. It demonstrated that he could build something worthy of his fortune. For a few years, everything worked perfectly. The ballroom filled with music. The dining room hosted elegant dinners. The reception room welcomed the elite of San Francisco. Agnes played piano for guests. William discussed business with associates in the library. They used the house the way it was meant to be used. And then, in the summer of 1921, everything changed. William was 64 years old. He'd been feeling odd, headaches, occasional dizziness. Nothing dramatic, nothing that seemed serious. Until the stroke hit. Chapter 5. Designing the Gardens. While Willis Polk was building the house, William Bourne was planning something equally ambitious outside. 16 acres of formal gardens. Not English cottage gardens with romantic disorder, not Japanese meditation spaces. Formal gardens in the grand European tradition. Geometry, symmetry, structure. William knew what he wanted. Garden rooms that connected to the house architecturally, creating a unified vision. He wanted spaces for different purposes. Entertaining, strolling, quiet contemplation, growing flowers and vegetables. What he needed was someone who understood garden architecture. Bruce Porter got the call in 1917. Porter was 54 years old, a Renaissance figure in San Francisco's art world. He painted murals. He designed stained glass windows. He created gardens for wealthy clients. He'd survived the earthquake and helped rebuild the city's cultural institutions. More importantly, Porter understood how gardens should relate to architecture. He'd studied European estates. He knew Gertrude Jekyll's work in England. He understood Italian Renaissance principles, using walls, hedges, and geometric patterns to create outdoor rooms. William and Bruce walked the land together. The site sloped gently upward from the house toward the hills. Perfect for creating terraces and changes in level. Natural features, mature oak trees, rock outcroppings, could be incorporated rather than removed. Porter's vision took shape over months of planning. The garden would extend south from the house along a central axis. A series of enclosed spaces would open one from another, creating progression and discovery. Brick walls would define some areas. Clipped hedges would shape others. The formality would be absolute. This wasn't meant to look natural. It was meant to look controlled. Nature bent to human will and artistic vision. But Porter was the architect. He drew the bones of the garden. Someone else would make it breathe. Isabella Warren entered the project in 1917 as the horticulturist. She was 48 years old, from an established California family that had lost its fortune in bad mining investments. She and her sisters had started a floral design business in San Francisco, creating elaborate arrangements for society events. Bella, everyone called her Bella, had an artist's eye for color and a plants person's understanding of what would actually grow. She'd worked on gardens throughout the Bay Area. Wealthy clients trusted her judgment completely. At Filoli, Bella's role was specific. Choose every plant, coordinate seasonal color, ensure the garden looked perfect year-round. She worked within Porter's structure. He specified where hedges would go, how tall they should be, where paths would run. Bella decided which species to use, what colors would appear in which seasons, how to create the layered effect the garden needed. The partnership worked because both understood the assignment. Porter provided the architecture. Bella provided the living art. Work began in 1917 and continued through 1922. This wasn't something you completed in a single season. Creating a mature garden required time. The first major space visitors encountered after leaving the house was the sunken garden. Porter designed it as a rectangular space sunken below the surrounding grade, with a reflecting pool at the center. The pool measured 8,000 gallons, substantial enough to create real reflections to feel like a significant water feature. It was lined to prevent seepage. Water lilies were planted to provide both tropical and hardy varieties blooming at different times. Bella flanked the pool with panels of lawn and planted twin olive trees. Japanese yew hedges enclosed the entire space, clipped to perfect geometric shapes. The sunken garden made a statement. We control water. In California, where water meant power and water meant wealth, an 8,000-gallon ornamental pool was pure luxury. William charged San Francisco residents by the gallon. Here at Filoli, water existed for beauty. From the sunken garden, the axis continued upward through a series of walled enclosures. The High Place, the Woodland Garden, the Rose Garden. Each space had its own character, its own purpose, but all connected through Porter's architectural framework. Brick walls were crucial. They created microclimates, protected plants from wind, provided structure for espalier fruit trees. They also prevented visitors from seeing the entire garden at once. You discovered each space by moving through it. Porter designed a bowling green, a perfectly flat lawn for lawn bowling, the English game William enjoyed. Clipped hedges surrounded it. No flowers here, just geometric precision. He created a walled garden divided into sections like a giant garden quilt. Bella filled these sections with seasonal displays that changed throughout the year. Spring tulips and daffodils, summer roses and salvias, fall chrysanthemums. The colors rotated, but the structure remained constant. One of William's specific requests was incorporating Irish yews at Filoli. These columnar evergreens grew vertically, creating living architectural elements. William had purchased Muckross House in Ireland for his daughter, and the estate there had spectacular yews. Bella arranged for cuttings to be taken at Muckross, grown at the Empire Mine Cottage in Grass Valley, then transported to Filoli. 210 Irish yews eventually lined pathways and created alleys throughout the garden. Every time William walked these paths, he would see plants that connected Filoli to his daughter's estate in Ireland. A living link across an ocean. The gardens required constant maintenance. Hedges needed clipping to maintain their geometry. Flowers had to be dead-headed and replaced seasonally. Lawns needed mowing. Paths needed weeding. By the late 1920s, Filoli employed 12 full-time gardeners. The head gardener, Louis Mariconi, lived on site and supervised the work. He would remain at Filoli for 50 years. Bella Warren continued overseeing the plantings and color schemes. She visited regularly, making adjustments, ordering new plants, ensuring everything met her standards. The garden that emerged from this collaboration was unlike anything else in California. It combined Italian Renaissance structure with English planting traditions and California plants. It looked both ancient and contemporary. It felt European, but belonged completely to this landscape. By 1922, the bones were in place. The garden was still young. Hedges needed years to fully mature, trees needed time to grow. But the vision was clear. William could stand at the top of the garden, looking down past the terraces and walls and hedges toward the house, with Crystal Springs Reservoir sparkling in the distance. He'd created what he set out to create, a place of beauty, a place to grow young. Except he was sitting in a wheelchair. The stroke had come the previous summer. William Bowers, born II, would never walk through his gardens again. Chapter 6. The Irish Connection. Maud Bourne was born in 1883, the second child and only daughter to survive infancy. An older brother had died at 1 day old. For the rest of her life, Maud would be the center of her parents' attention. She grew up in the Webster Street mansion in San Francisco, educated by private tutors, trained in music and art and languages. Everything expected of a wealthy daughter. Her father was busy building the Empire Mine fortune. Her mother was active in San Francisco society and the arts. By 1910, Maud was 26, dangerously close to being considered an old maid by the standards of the time. She needed to marry, and marry well. That spring, she met Arthur Rose Vincent. Arthur was from County Clare, Ireland. His family had connections but limited money, the common situation for Irish gentry in the early 20th century. Large estates required constant maintenance. Agricultural rents were falling. Many Irish families were land-rich and cash-poor. Arthur was 44, 18 years older than Maud. He'd been married before. His first wife had died. The courtship moved quickly. William and Agnes liked Arthur well enough. More importantly, they wanted Maud settled. The wedding took place in March 1910 at St. Dominic's Church in San Francisco. It was a major society event. The Bournes spared no expense. For a wedding gift, William did something extraordinary. He purchased an entire Irish estate. Muckross House sat on the shores of Muckross Lake in County Kerry, Ireland. The house itself had been built in the 1840s, a substantial Victorian mansion in Tudor Revival style. The estate covered 11,000 acres of spectacular landscape, mountains, lakes, ancient forests. It was exactly the kind of property Arthur's family would have owned generations earlier, but could no longer afford to maintain. William bought it outright and deeded it to Maud and Arthur. The price was never disclosed publicly, but the purchase made international news. An American mining millionaire had bought a piece of Ireland for his daughter. William also promised to pay the annual costs of running Muckross, roughly $65,000 per year, plus an additional $25,000 allowance for Maud and Arthur's personal expenses, equivalent to several $1,000,000 today. Maud wouldn't have a title. Arthur wasn't nobility, but she would live like Irish aristocracy. The young couple moved to Muckross. They settled into estate life. Arthur managed the property. Maud became involved in local community affairs. In 1911, Maud was presented at the Court of St. James, a formal introduction to British royalty that confirmed her elevated social status. For William, the Irish connection meant something beyond just securing his daughter's future. Muckross House became a model for what he wanted at Filoli. The estate gardens at Muckross featured yews, ancient, massive specimens that had been growing for decades. William arranged for cuttings to be taken so identical plants could be grown at Filoli. He visited Muckross several times in the years after Maud's marriage. He walked the grounds. He saw how an established estate functioned. He brought those ideas back to California. But then came the stroke in 1921. William woke one morning at Filoli feeling wrong. Numbness in his face. Difficulty speaking. Agnes called for doctors immediately. The stroke was severe. At 64 years old, William's body had betrayed him. He survived, but the damage was permanent. His left side was partially paralyzed. He needed a wheelchair. His speech was affected, though his mind remained sharp. He would never travel to Ireland again. For a man who'd spent his life in motion, managing mines, overseeing water systems, building estates, confinement to a wheelchair was devastating. The gardens he'd created were still accessible, at least partially. Staff would wheel him to viewing points, but the freedom to explore was gone. William missed Muckross. He missed walking those Irish gardens. He missed seeing his daughter. In 1921, he commissioned Ernest Peixoto to paint a series of murals for Filoli's ballroom. Peixoto was a well-known American painter, 50 years old, who'd worked extensively in Europe. He'd painted murals for other California estates. He understood what William wanted. Large-scale canvases depicting Muckross House and its surrounding landscape. Peixoto created the paintings in his San Francisco studio, working from photographs and descriptions. He painted atmospheric Irish scenes, mountains shrouded in mist, lakes reflecting gray skies, the house itself nestled in the landscape. The finished canvases were enormous. They were installed in the ballroom in 1921, covering large sections of the walls. Now William could sit in his ballroom and look at Ireland. He couldn't travel there, but he could see it. Every time he was wheeled into that room, he saw his daughter's estate. Maud visited Filoli when she could, crossing the Atlantic by ship, a journey that took weeks. But her life was in Ireland now. She had responsibilities there. The years passed. William continued suffering small additional strokes. His condition gradually worsened. He remained mentally alert, but physically weakened. Agnes cared for him while maintaining the estate. She continued hosting smaller gatherings when William felt able. She kept the gardens maintained to his standards. Every morning, weather permitting, staff would wheel William to a specific spot at the top of the garden. From there, he could see down past the terraces toward the house, with the reservoirs and valley spread beyond. His valley, his water, his creation. He sat there, unable to walk, looking at what he'd built. In 1929, a telegram arrived from New York. Maud had been traveling back to Ireland after visiting friends in Manhattan. She'd caught pneumonia during the voyage. By the time the ship docked, she was gravely ill. She died in Manhattan on November 18th, 1929. She was 45 years old. William and Agnes were devastated. Their only surviving child was gone. William was too weak to travel to New York for the funeral. Agnes went alone. Maud's body was brought back to California. She was buried in the family cemetery on the Filoli estate, next to the infant brother who died at birth. After Maud's death, William began selling his holdings. The Empire Mine went to Newmont Mining Corporation. He was putting his affairs in order. He'd built an empire, created Filoli, secured his daughter's future in Ireland. Now his daughter was buried in the garden, and he was trapped in a wheelchair. The Irish connection that had meant so much became a source of pain. The ballroom murals showed a place he'd never see again, where his daughter had lived and would never return from. William lasted 7 more years. Chapter 7. The Stroke. The summer of 1921 started normally at Filoli. William was 64, still managing his business interests despite spending more time at the estate. Agnes was 59, increasingly focused on the gardens. The house and grounds were complete. The gardens were maturing beautifully. Then one morning, William couldn't get out of bed properly. His left side wasn't responding correctly. His face felt strange. When he tried to speak, the words came out slurred. Agnes immediately called for doctors from San Francisco. The diagnosis was clear: stroke. Significant damage to the right side of his brain, affecting the left side of his body. In 1921, there was no effective treatment for stroke beyond rest, and hoping the patient didn't have another one. Doctors could do nothing but wait and assess the damage. William survived the initial event, but the paralysis remained. His left leg was weak enough that walking was impossible. His left arm had limited function. His speech was affected, though he could still communicate. His mind remained completely clear, which meant he understood exactly what had happened to him. A wheelchair became permanent. The man who'd saved the Empire Mine by pushing deeper when others said stop. Who'd built Spring Valley Water Company into a monopoly. Who'd created Filoli as his masterpiece. That man was now confined to a chair, dependent on others to move him. For someone as active as William had been, this was its own kind of death. The house required modifications, ramps where there had been steps, wider doorways to accommodate the wheelchair, arrangements for staff to assist with daily needs. The gardens became both salvation and torture. William could still be wheeled outside. Staff would take him to specific viewing points, places where the paths were level enough for the chair to stop safely. Every morning, weather permitting, he asked to be brought to the high point of the garden. From there, he could see down the terraces toward the house and out to Crystal Springs Reservoir beyond. His reservoir. His water company's infrastructure. The valley he'd controlled for years. He could see it all, he just couldn't walk through it anymore. Agnes adjusted to her new role. She'd always been active in the estate's development, but now she became essential to its operation. She met with gardeners. She made decisions about plantings. She managed the household staff. She also became William's primary companion. They'd been married 40 years. She'd seen him build an empire. Now she watched him diminish. But William wasn't ready to give up completely. He commissioned the Muckross murals for the ballroom, enormous paintings showing his daughter's Irish estate. If he couldn't travel to Ireland, he'd bring Ireland to Filoli. He continued managing his business interests, at least the parts that didn't require physical presence. Associates came to Filoli for meetings. He read reports. He made decisions. But his body kept betraying him. He suffered additional smaller strokes over the years. Each one took something more. Agnes became his eyes and legs for the gardens. She'd walk the paths, then return to describe what she'd seen. Which flowers were blooming, how the hedges looked, whether the gardeners were maintaining the standards William demanded. She also took over the social aspects of the estate. William couldn't host large gatherings anymore, but Agnes could invite smaller groups. She held musical afternoons. She hosted garden parties where guests could admire what William had created. The estate's gardens had become locally famous. Garden clubs from San Francisco requested permission to visit. Agnes carefully controlled these visits, allowing select groups to tour but maintaining privacy. She was protecting what William had built while he sat in his wheelchair, unable to fully enjoy it. By the mid-1920s, William's condition had stabilized at a new, diminished level. He could sit, he could communicate, he could be wheeled to viewing points. But he would never walk again. Staff developed routines around his needs. Morning wheelchair trip to the garden viewpoint. Afternoon rest. Evening time in the library or ballroom, depending on whether Agnes was hosting. The man who'd controlled so much now controlled very little. He couldn't choose when to move from room to room without assistance. He couldn't walk through his own garden. He couldn't travel to see his daughter in Ireland. What he could do was watch. Watch the gardens mature. Watch Agnes manage the estate. Watch his business empire continue operating under new management. In 1929, the telegram about Maud arrived. William was 72, wheelchair-bound, when he learned his only surviving child had died of pneumonia in Manhattan, too weak to travel to New York, unable to attend her funeral. Agnes went alone, then returned with Maud's body for burial at Filoli. After that, something changed in William. He began systematically disposing of his holdings. The Empire mine sold. Spring Valley Water Company negotiations accelerated. The city would purchase it the following year for $41 million. He was preparing for the end. Agnes understood. She'd been watching her husband die slowly for 8 years. The stroke hadn't killed him, but it had begun a process that couldn't be stopped. Staff continued wheeling William to his viewing spot each morning. He'd sit there, looking down at the gardens and out to the valley beyond, thinking whatever thoughts a man thinks when his empire is ending. Agnes would come find him after a while. They'd sit together quietly. 49 years of marriage. Most of it had been good. The last decade had been hard. She was 73 years old. She was tired. In January 1936, Agnes fell ill. The details aren't clear in the records. Possibly pneumonia, possibly heart failure. At 75, her body simply gave out. She died on January 20th, 1936. William was now alone at Filoli. His daughter was buried in the garden. His wife of 54 years was gone. He was 78 years old, confined to a wheelchair. In a 56-room mansion he could barely navigate. He lasted 6 months. On July 5th, 1936, William Bowers-Bourne II died at Filoli. The official cause was listed as complications from his long-term paralysis and multiple strokes. He was buried in the family cemetery on the estate next to Agnes and Maud. 4 members of the Bourne family are in that cemetery: William, Agnes, Maud, and the infant son who died in 1882, whose body had been moved to Filoli from its original burial site. The estate William built to grow young had become the place where his family ended. Chapter 8, The End of an Era. The Filoli estate went on the market in 1937. There were no direct heirs. Maud was dead. She and Arthur Vincent had no children. William's siblings had their own lives and families. Nobody in the immediate Bourne family wanted to take on a 654-acre estate that required enormous maintenance costs. The property needed a specific kind of buyer, someone wealthy enough to afford both the purchase price and the annual operating expenses. Someone who understood what Filoli represented and would maintain it properly. The price was never publicly disclosed. Real estate transactions of this magnitude were handled discreetly. Several potential buyers looked at the property. Most decided it was too much, too large, too expensive to operate, too isolated despite being only 30 miles from San Francisco. One couple saw something different. William P. Roth and Lurline Matson Roth visited Filoli in 1937. Lurline was the daughter of Captain William Matson, founder of the Matson Navigation Company. The company operated the famous white ships that sailed between San Francisco and Hawaii. By the time of his death in 1917, Captain Matson had built one of the most successful shipping lines in the Pacific. Lurline inherited a substantial fortune. Her husband William, known as Bill, became president of Matson Navigation. Together they represented another generation of California wealth. They already owned property. They had a home in San Francisco. But Filoli offered something unique. Lurline looked at the gardens and saw potential. She was an accomplished gardener herself, knowledgeable about plants and design. The 16 acres of formal gardens at Filoli were already spectacular, but she could imagine expanding them further. Bill saw a country retreat where they could escape San Francisco's social obligations, a place to relax. The house was impressive enough to entertain when necessary, but private enough to feel like escape. They had 3 children, twin daughters, Lurleen and Berenice, who were teenagers in 1937, a son, William, who was 21. The family could use the estate for gatherings. The Roths purchased Filoli later that year. They moved in and began making it their own. The transition was respectful. Lurleen understood what the Bournes had created. She didn't want to erase their vision. She wanted to build on it. Much of the original furniture had been sold off before the estate changed hands, but the architectural features remained. The ballroom with its Muckross murals, the oak-paneled dining room, the reception room's grand staircase. Lurleen gradually refurnished the house with period-appropriate pieces. She worked with decorators to ensure rooms looked lived in rather than museum-like. But her real passion was the gardens. Isabella Warren was still alive in 1937, still supervising plantings at Filoli. She was 68 years old, with decades of experience creating gardens for California's wealthiest families. Lurleen approached Bella about continuing the work. The 2 women developed a strong working relationship. Bella had exacting standards and didn't tolerate clients who tried to micromanage. But Lurleen knew plants. She understood design. She respected Bella's expertise. Together, they began expanding the gardens beyond what William Bourne had created. Lurleen wanted more botanical diversity. She was particularly interested in camellias, rhododendrons, and azaleas, plants that thrived in the peninsula's climate and provided year-round color. The woodland garden area received major attention. New plantings created layers of texture and seasonal interest. Shade-loving plants filled areas under the mature oaks. The goal was making the wilder areas of the estate as interesting as the formal gardens. Lurleen also wanted a swimming pool. Not just a small lap pool, but a substantial facility that could accommodate family and guests. The pool was built in 1946. Its placement required careful consideration. It needed to feel integrated into the garden design rather than imposed on it. Bella designed the pool pavilion and surrounding plantings. She also arranged for a section of the Irish ULA to be transplanted, moving mature trees to create the backdrop for the pool area. The work was technically challenging. Moving established yews without killing them required expertise, but it succeeded. The pool area looked like it had always been part of the garden plan. Bill Roth's health began declining in the late 1950s. Like William Bourne before him, Bill suffered a stroke. The pool had been built partly with his rehabilitation in mind. Swimming was considered therapeutic. Bill died in 1963. Lurleen was widowed at 70. She continued living at Filoli alone, maintaining the estate with the same attention she'd always given it. She still worked in the gardens. She still hosted select social gatherings. Isabella Warren had died in 1950, which meant Lurleen took on more direct responsibility for garden decisions. She consulted with landscape architects when needed, but she knew the gardens intimately. She understood what grew where and why. By the 1970s, Lurleen was in her 80s. The estate required constant maintenance. The house needed updates. The gardens needed year-round care. She faced the question every owner of a historic estate eventually faces. What happens next? She had no interest in selling to someone who might divide the property or fail to maintain it properly. She'd spent nearly 40 years at Filoli. She understood what it represented. Not just her own history, but California's history. There was one organization that might preserve the estate properly, the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Lurleen reached out to the trust in the early 1970s. Could they take ownership? Would they maintain it as a historic site? Could the public eventually visit? The trust was interested. Filoli was exactly the kind of property they existed to preserve, an intact early 20th century estate that told a significant story about American wealth and culture. Negotiations took time. The trust needed to ensure they could afford the ongoing maintenance. Lurleen needed to ensure they'd preserve what she and the Bournes had created. In 1975, Lurline Matson Roth donated the entire Filoli estate to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The donation included the house, gardens, and surrounding acreage. She also provided a substantial endowment to help cover annual operating costs. Her reasoning was simple, summarized in one sentence. Filoli is too beautiful to be private. The estate opened to the public later that year. For the first time since 1917, strangers could walk through the gardens William Bourne and Bruce Porter and Isabella Warren had created. They could see the house Willis Polk had designed. They could understand what Gilded Age wealth had built. Lurline moved to a smaller home nearby. She lived to see Filoli succeed as a public site, drawing visitors who appreciated what she'd helped preserve. The estate that had been built for one man's vision and maintained by one woman's dedication had become something larger. It belonged to everyone now. But before it became famous as a public site, before the preservation and the visitors and the recognition, something else happened. Hollywood discovered Filoli. Chapter 9, Paradise on Screen. In 1978, 3 years after Filoli opened to the public, a film crew arrived. Director Warren Beatty was making Heaven Can Wait, a fantasy comedy about a football player who dies prematurely and returns to Earth in a different body. The film needed a location that represented ultimate luxury, a mansion so beautiful it could plausibly be heaven. Beatty's location scouts found Filoli. The ballroom became a gym where Beatty's character exercised. The grounds provided stunning exterior shots. The formal gardens offered the kind of timeless beauty the script required. Heaven Can Wait was a major studio production with significant distribution. When it released, millions saw Filoli without knowing its name or history. They just saw one of the most beautiful estates ever captured on film. The movie succeeded commercially and critically. It received 9 Academy Award nominations. The exposure put Filoli in front of an enormous audience. But that was nothing compared to what came next. In 1981, ABC television launched Dynasty, a primetime soap opera about the wealthy Carrington family and their oil empire in Denver, Colorado. The show needed establishing shots showing the Carrington mansion, something grand, something that screamed wealth and power. They chose Filoli for the aerial shots. Every episode of Dynasty opened the same way. Helicopter camera swooping over a spectacular estate, the formal gardens, the Georgian mansion, the perfect embodiment of Gilded Age luxury. The show never filmed interiors at Filoli. Those were recreated on sound stages in Los Angeles. But the exterior shots were unmistakably Filoli. Dynasty became a massive hit. At its peak, over 20 million people watched each episode. The show ran for 9 seasons, from 1981 to 1989. Nearly 200 episodes, which meant Filoli appeared in 200 opening sequences seen by millions of viewers worldwide. The effect was strange. The show was supposedly set in Denver. The mansion was called the Carrington Estate, but observant viewers recognized the location. Garden clubs knew. Architecture enthusiasts knew. Northern California residents definitely knew. Filoli became famous without most viewers knowing what they were looking at. The exposure had practical effects. Tourism increased dramatically. People who'd seen Dynasty wanted to visit the real location. Asian tourists in particular became significant visitors. The show had been popular internationally. The National Trust capitalized on this carefully. They didn't advertise Filoli as the Dynasty Mansion, but they didn't hide it either. Tour guides would mention the connection. Gift shop items referenced the show subtly. Other productions followed. The Joy Luck Club filmed scenes there in 1993. Television shows used it for location shots. Commercials featured the gardens. But Dynasty remained the primary cultural reference. For an entire generation, Filoli was that house from Dynasty, even if they didn't know its real name. The Bourne family was long gone by then. William and Agnes were buried on the property, invisible to tourists. Maud was buried beside them. Their story wasn't part of the public tour in the early years. Lurline Roth died in 1985, 10 years after donating the estate. She lived long enough to see Filoli succeed as a public site, but didn't witness its peak fame. The National Trust managed Filoli as a nonprofit organization. Volunteers led tours. Garden clubs worked on plantings. Educational programs brought school groups to learn about history and horticulture. By the 2000s, Filoli was drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. The gardens remained spectacular. Continuous maintenance kept them at the standards Isabella Warren would have demanded. The house was gradually refurnished with period-appropriate pieces, many donated by families who'd known the Bournes or Roths. The ballroom's muckross murals were preserved and restored. The dining room looked much as it had in William's time. In 2023, Filoli made international news again for completely different reasons. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping needed a location for an informal summit during the APEC conference in San Francisco. They needed somewhere private, secure, and impressive enough to represent both nations. They chose Filoli. On November 15th, 2023, the two most powerful leaders in the world met at the estate William Bourne had built. They walked the same gardens William had designed. They talked in rooms Willis Polk had created. The meeting generated enormous media coverage. International news outlets showed Filoli's gardens. Diplomatic analysts discussed the setting's significance. Chinese media paid particular attention. The estate was already well known among Chinese tourists from the dynasty years. The Biden-Xi summit represented something unexpected. This private estate, built by a water monopolist who died nearly 90 years earlier, had become a neutral ground for international diplomacy. From William Bourne's private retreat to Hollywood location to diplomatic venue, the estate had lived multiple lives. But it survived because Lurline Roth made one crucial decision in 1975. She could have sold it, divided it, let it become something else. Instead, she gave it away. Too beautiful to be private. Those 5 words saved Filoli. Chapter 10. Filoli Forever. Today, Filoli draws over 400,000 visitors annually. They come from around the world, from China, where dynasty made the estate famous, from across the United States, where garden enthusiasts know it by reputation, from San Francisco, where families make repeated visits to see seasonal changes. The gardens bloom year-round. In spring, 75,000 bulbs create waves of color: daffodils, tulips, hyacinths. In summer, roses explode in the walled garden while salvias and zinnias fill the beds. Fall brings chrysanthemums and changing leaf colors. Winter features camellias blooming in the woodland garden. The horticultural staff plants according to historic photographs and oral histories. They maintain the vision Isabella Warren established and Lurline Roth expanded. The garden looks simultaneously historic and contemporary, rooted in the past but alive in the present. The house operates as a museum, though calling it that undersells what it represents. This isn't a preserved relic. It's a complete Gilded Age estate that survived intact. Most estates from this period were destroyed or drastically altered. Peninsula neighbors of Filoli, the Crocker estate, the Cole Mansion, dozens of others, were divided, demolished, or converted to other uses. The post-World War II era saw massive social changes. Maintaining huge estates became economically impractical and socially uncomfortable. Filoli survived because of timing and luck. It passed from the Bournes to the Roths to the National Trust without ever being divided or sold to developers. The 654 acres remained intact. That makes it extraordinary. Filoli represents something that no longer exists elsewhere, a complete example of how California's Gilded Age elite lived. You can walk through every major room. The ballroom still has Ernest Pichotto's Muckross murals. The dining room retains its oak paneling. The reception room looks much as it did when Agnes Bourne greeted guests. The kitchen shows the machinery required to support elegant entertaining. The butler's pantry reveals the invisible labor. The servants' quarters demonstrate the class divisions that made such estates possible. Filoli doesn't hide the less comfortable aspects of its history. Modern interpretation acknowledges that this lifestyle depended on low-wage workers. That William Bourne's water monopoly hurt ordinary San Franciscans. That Gilded Age wealth came from exploitation as much as innovation, but it also preserves beauty that would otherwise be lost. The gardens Bruce Porter designed are still here. The architectural details Willis Polk specified remain visible. The vision William and Agnes Bourne had for this place can still be understood. The estate sits on land that was home to the Ramaytush Ohlone people for thousands of years before European settlement. Recent interpretation has begun acknowledging this history. The Lamchin Interpretive Center works with Ramaytush Ohlone descendants to tell a more complete story. The San Andreas Fault runs directly through the property. A bridge on the nature trail marks where you cross from the North American tectonic plate to the Pacific plate. The earthquake fault that devastated San Francisco in 1906 passes beneath Filoli's gardens. William Bourne built here anyway. He understood the risks. California has always been earthquake country. You build carefully and accept the reality. The estate requires constant maintenance. 16 acres of formal gardens don't maintain themselves. The house needs ongoing preservation work. Historic buildings have unique needs. You can't just replace things with modern equivalents. The National Trust operates Filoli as a self-sustaining nonprofit. Admission fees, memberships, and donations cover most operating costs. Lurline Roth's endowment helps, but it doesn't cover everything. This creates an interesting dynamic. The estate, built by extreme private wealth, now operates as public space, supported by many small contributions. It's become democratic in a way William Bourne never intended. Educational programs bring thousands of school children to learn about history, horticulture, architecture. Garden clubs study the plantings. Architecture students examine Willis Polk's design. Historians research the Bourne and Roth families. The Biden-Xi Summit in 2023 created renewed interest. International media coverage introduced Filoli to audiences who'd never heard of it. Chinese tourists, already familiar with the estate from Dynasty, came in larger numbers. That summit also demonstrated Filoli's ongoing relevance. It's not just a museum piece. It's a place where significant events still happen. Weddings take place in the gardens. Corporate events use the grounds. Concerts happen in the ballroom where Agnes Bourne once played piano. The estate remains active, not frozen. 4 graves sit in a small cemetery on the property. William Bowers Bourne II, Agnes Moody Bourne, Maud Bourne Vincent, an infant son who died in 1882. Visitors don't typically see these graves. They're not part of the public tour, but they're there, reminders that this was someone's home, that real people lived here, suffered here, died here. William built Filoli as a place to grow young. Instead, it became the place where his family ended and where his legacy began. The estate he created outlived him by nearly 90 years so far. It will likely outlast this century. The National Trust's preservation ensures that future generations will see what he built. Whether William would approve of Filoli becoming public space is unknowable. He built it for privacy. He controlled access rigidly. The thought of 400,000 strangers walking through his gardens each year might have horrified him, but he's gone. Agnes is gone. Maud is gone. Lurline Roth is gone. Filoli remains. The gardens bloom every spring exactly as Isabella Warren designed them. The ballroom still echoes with music occasionally. The reservoir William controlled still sparkles in the distance. The estate survives because Lurline Roth understood something William Bourne couldn't have known in 1917 when construction finished. Some things are too beautiful to keep. Some places belong to everyone, whether their builders intended that or not. Filoli was built by one man's fortune and ego. It survived because one woman chose to give it away. That's its real legacy. Not the wealth that created it, not the tragedy that marked it, but the decision to share it. 400,000 people walk through William Bourne's dream every year. They see what he saw. They walk where he walked. They stand where he stood in his wheelchair, looking down at the gardens and out to the valley beyond. His empire is gone. Spring Valley Water Company dissolved decades ago. The Empire Mine closed in 1956. The fortune dispersed. But the garden remains. The house stands. The vision persists. That's what survives from the Gilded Age. Not the money. Not the power. the beauty. And maybe that's enough. When William Bowers, born II, sat in his wheelchair at the top of the garden, looking down toward the house he'd built and the valley he'd controlled, he couldn't have imagined what Filoli would become. He built it as a private retreat, a place where San Francisco's elite could gather away from the city, a statement of his accomplishments, a gift to his wife, a connection to his daughter in Ireland. He died there in 1936, buried in the garden alongside his family. Filoli passed to the Roths, who added their own chapter. Lurleen expanded the gardens. She maintained the estate for nearly 40 years. Then she did something unexpected. She gave it all away. Today, Filoli stands as California's last intact Gilded Age estate on the San Francisco Peninsula. Every similar property was divided, demolished, or drastically altered. Filoli alone survived complete. The gardens that Bruce Porter designed and Isabella Warren planted still bloom according to their vision. The house that Willis Polk created still demonstrates his understanding of Georgian architecture adapted to California. 400,000 people visit annually. They see beauty created by extreme wealth but preserved for everyone. They walk through rooms where William and Agnes entertained. They see murals painted for a man who could no longer travel. They experience a complete example of how California's elite lived a century ago. The story isn't simple. William Bourne built his fortune by controlling San Francisco's water, a monopoly that hurt ordinary people. The Empire Mine that funded Filoli employed workers in dangerous conditions for low wages. The elegant lifestyle the estate represents depended on servants working 14-hour days. But Filoli also preserves irreplaceable beauty. Gardens that took decades to mature. Architecture that demonstrates exceptional craft. A vision that succeeded completely. The Bourne family is gone, their fortune dispersed, their businesses dissolved or sold. But the estate remains because Lurleen Roth understood something profound. Some things are too beautiful to keep. Filoli wasn't meant to be public. It was built for privacy. William would likely be appalled by tour groups walking through his gardens. But William isn't here to object. His only surviving legacy is what he built. And that legacy belongs to everyone now. The estate survives, changed but intact. The gardens bloom, the house stands, the vision persists. That's what remains from the Gilded Age, not the empires, not the fortunes, the gardens. If you visit Filoli today, you'll walk paths where William was wheeled in his chair. You'll see the ballroom where Agnes played piano. You'll stand where Lurleen worked for decades preserving what the Bournes created. You won't see the family cemetery. It's not part of the tour, but you'll understand why Filoli matters. Why it was worth preserving. Why 400,000 people come each year to see gardens and a mansion built by a water monopolist who died nearly 90 years ago. Because beauty transcends its origins. Because places can mean more than their builders intended. Because sometimes the things we create outlive us in ways we never imagined. Filoli is too beautiful to be private. Lurleen Roth was right.